thank you for joining us. I'd like to introduce our guest for this conversation, Dr. Ron Ferguson, the founder of Tripod and one of the chief architects of the 7C survey, among other instruments that Tripod Surveys is implemented in schools around the U.S., around the world. And my name is Byron Adams. I'm the vice president of Tripod and have the privilege of being the leader of the company at this point. So the conversation with Ron today is going to just focus on a little bit more background of Tripod and his background as a leader in education, as a researcher. And we're eager to tell you about more about this company and about the leadership here. So Ron, thank you for joining me. And first question I have for you is just what was the inspiration behind the development of Tripod and the 7C survey, and what motivated you to focus on the specific dimensions of the 7Cs?
Well, the motivation for Tripod in the first place was that I started doing work on achievement gaps in the late 1990s. And to make a long story short, started working with a thing called the Minority Student Achievement Network, actually after I'd already been working with Shaker Heights. And in Shaker Heights, we wanted to understand what students were experiencing in the classroom. It was a high school teacher's idea. So we want to close these achievement gaps. We think the Black kids might be experiencing something different, so let's ask them. And so we collaborated initially, me and educators in Shaker Heights, on designing the first version of the Tripod surveys. We are currently in our 18th or 19th version of it. So it gets revised every year, updated a bit. But from the very beginning, the Tripod actually was content, pedagogy, and relationships. And the idea is that teachers need to have content knowledge. That's content. They need to have the skills to deliver that knowledge to students. That's pedagogy. And they needed to have the skills to connect with students in a personal way to engage students. And so that was content, pedagogy, and relationships. And then there's a framework due to Erik Erikson that I've also found in, I think, 6 or 7 different literatures with different labels, but it tracks the progression of relationships in contexts where you're trying to get work done. It starts initially, there's a little honeymoon the first few days where everybody's on their best behavior. Then there's a power struggle where kids are trying to figure out what they can actually get away with in the classroom. Right. And then depending on how the power struggle is resolved, people become more or less committed to a high achievement. That's this third issue, which is, the goal orientation, how ambitious they're going to be. And then with whatever level of ambition they have, they try to follow through, and they're always they're challenges when you try to follow through. So that's a period when you're trying to stay diligent and not get off task. And at the end of it, there's sort of a wrap up when you figure out, oh, well, I did it. Look how well I did. I'm really looking forward to next year. Or this is a terrible year. I never want to come back here again. Right. And so those 5 stages were the engagement framework around which we initially structured the Tripod surveys. And so we still have, in the full version of the Tripod survey, there's also a lot of student engagement questions that fill this out. And so we had the 3 legs of the Tripod and the 5 tasks and stages of classroom engagement. And over time, the survey evolved some. We refined it every year. We throw out items that didn't work, try to add in new items. And then when it got time to do the Gates project, the Measures of Effective Teaching project, that is well known as the MET project, biggest project the world has ever known on measuring teacher quality, where they had our Tripod surveys with a student voice piece. They had, I think, 6 different instruments for classroom management. They trained people, classroom observation, and they trained people to observe classrooms. And they had standardized test scores, the reading and math test scores. And there was 6 different cities they ran this project in. And it was around the time that the MET project started that they wanted a more explicit focus on teaching than we already had. We had some measures of teaching that were built in, where we were trying to pick up content, pedagogy, relationships, and so on. But we decided to go from there and just designed a more more blown out framework for teaching. And we had a lot to start with on that. The idea that you have both support and press has been a long-standing idea in education. You want to be supported, but you also want to have standards and hold to students accountable. And so the 7 C's really cover 3 basic ideas. One is relationships, which is we capture by care and confer. The second is pedagogy, which we capture by captivate, clarify, and consolidate. And the third is really accountability or academic press, which capture by challenge and classroom management. Because challenge and classroom management are kind of getting kids to do stuff they don't want to do sometimes. Sit still, pay attention, behave yourself. Don't give up when the work becomes difficult. Try to really understand things, not just memorize them. Because basically challenge has the 2 components of persistence and rigor are built into challenge, right? Just like we could break down clarify into some subcomponents. But it was in order to really flesh out the way we understand instruction that around 2008 we added the 7 C's to the engagement framework that we already had.
And I think underlies a lot of the sort of unique focus of Tripod's surveys that, prior to you and Tripod rolling out the 7 C's, from my knowledge, there was not a national instrument that helped to measure effective teaching, especially from the student perspective, giving students that voice. So, I'll kind of reflect on my time as a teacher. I was a teacher in Los Angeles from 2008 to 2011 and taught high school. And I kind of sort of, supposed to remember student voice being an element of feedback that I was looking for, but there wasn't that I was aware of at that time a way to do that. So kind of working in the environment of education, then, what helped to motivate that focus on student perception as a component of measure of effective teaching, as opposed to, just grades and test scores, which I think traditionally have been the chief indicators.
There's always been some awareness that if you're trying to work with and help a group of people, you need to know what they think, right? You need to get some feedback from your audience,
right,
so to speak. And I think it was just time for that. There have been a few attempts in the past. If you go back in the literature, you'll find some things here and there where there was effort to reach out and get student voice. But I think when we started with the beginning of Tripod, we were working with schools who really wanted to narrow achievement gaps. So they were trying to get serious about figuring out what their students experiencing and how can we fine tune that experience in order to help them be their best selves more often.
Right.
The Minority Student Achievement Network, I think they started with maybe 15 districts initially. They grew after that. They were really trying to be serious about this. And so they wanted that feedback from students. And then obviously the Met Project, they were going to spend $50 to $100 million on this kind of thing. They figured, let's try to get it right. And so the issue is that students know what's happening in their classrooms. And often teachers would say, oh, they're just blowing it off. But they don't. And we have, checks that we can do. We have some words, some questions that we word both negatively and positively, and that should be negatively correlated with one another. Right. And they are negatively correlated with one another. We do checks to see whether students are just checking straight down the line. I mean, I think at one point I remember checking about 200,000 student surveys to see whether there are any on one part of the survey where students had just checked the same answer all the way down the line. And I might have found 11 out of 200,000. It was a really minuscule number. We had one kid at one point who told me, where did he write this? I forget what, it might even been in a student newspaper. Brookline student newspaper did a spoof on the Tripod surveys once.
Okay.
And it might have been in there. And the kid said, he said, at first I decided I was going to blow it off and write, and he said, but then I just felt stupid. So I went on and did it the right way.
Right. You
And so,
realize it's an opportunity to have a voice and to impact
yeah.
um, potential development of your teacher, which might help you as a student. So
And it's
uh,
just interesting. I mean,
yeah,
students say it's interesting asking these, never been asked these questions before. And
exactly. It's
so,
engaging, right?
yeah, it's
So
engaging. In fact, one of the people who worked for us that you'll know, Jake, uh, first encountered tripod surveys as a high school student in 2006.
right.
and, and he
I,
found it so interesting as a student. He said, I'm going to do this for a career. I got to find who did that. And he applied to Harvard and took my class and insisted on being hired because he was just hooked on this idea. And we employed him for 10 years after
yeah,
that.
right. What a
Yeah.
great story that is, and then also reflective of I
Yeah.
think larger sentiment for students too that this is engaging. As you said, there's not really another built-in time of the year or opportunity to give feedback
Right.
to your teacher,
And
right?
the stories, I mean, part of what's disappointing to me is that people don't take full advantage of the findings. I
Mm,
mean, the findings tend to be very nuanced. There are things that a teacher can't see in their classroom. For example, and it's some of it's on the engagement side that is underutilized. Um, Students will hide effort in classrooms, and particularly students who struggle.
mhm.
And so we find the more students struggle, the lower their GPA is, the more they agree. Sometimes in this class, I pretend I'm not trying when I really am,
Right,
right? And if a teacher is just trying to read their class in order to assess effort, they can get it wrong because it's better to look lazy than stupid from where the student is. So
right,
even if you really care, even if you're really trying, you'll hide that just so that people say don't conclude that you're not smart. So he just doesn't care about school. He's not trying. And so particularly on the peer dynamic side of things, there is a lot that adults, the teachers just can't see, but that you can find in the data. And people become so preoccupied with the 7 C's that they miss the other side of it. And I like to say schools have two curricula, the ones that the adults teach and the ones that kids teach.
mm,
Okay. And when the
absolutely,
kids show up at kindergarten, they start to learn the peer dynamic part of it. We have items that in my class, for the kindergarten survey, in our class, kids teach class kids who make mistakes. Or the way my classmates treat me hurts, the way my classmates treat me hurts my feelings. The answers to those questions are the strongest predictors to help avoidance. Sometimes in this class, when I need help, I don't ask for it.
right,
Right. And so we need to attend to the 7 C's and the delivery of instruction and how students experience that. But we also need to attend to the hidden side that the adults don't see, but that the kids experience every day and that has dramatic effects on engagement as largely as the effects that teaching has on
right.
engagement.
Yeah, right. And so it's teacher to student relationships and peer to peer relationships as well that motivate.
Actually, it's teacher to teacher also. We have teacher surveys. It's
Yes,
the
that's right.
dynamics among teachers in their own culture, among the adults in the building. So
Yep.
there's a culture among the adults in the building, and there's a culture among the students in the building, and then there's the interaction between those two cultures.
And families, yeah, right. And when you look
And
at
the families, they're whole different
the
cultures. I'm doing
whole,
consulting work on family engagement now.
right,
And so it's subtle. And if we can be learners as entire communities and take the time to sit back and review the feedback we're getting from the different segments of the community, we can imagine different ways of being. The challenge is making time to do that and having people who are skilled enough and skilled enough at the intellectual side of it and the interpersonal side of it to help put it together
right.
for other colleagues.
That's great. I wonder at this point, if you could speak to a little bit to some of the evidence or research that's linked improvements in tripod 7C scores from schools that have administered it to things like enhanced student engagement or enhanced academic achievement.
Yeah, we haven't studied that as much as we can, but let me give you a few examples. We did one study of teachers who, because we have a few school districts that we've surveyed for years, and in one district where we surveyed for several years, we interviewed teachers who had moved from being really low on average on the 7Cs to being really high, who had evolved from being pretty ineffective to being very effective, right? And we went in and we asked them why, what happened, okay? And there was some point at which they decided to get better, okay? And then once they decided to get better, they used every resource at their disposal to figure out how.
Right.
And the student feedback in the 7Cs were some of that feedback that they used to figure out how. And they moved the needle on that. What we didn't know to study before we did the project was what the trigger was that made them decide to get better. Okay, we don't know what that trigger was. I suspect in a lot of cases the trigger was their 7Cs findings, their 7Cs results.
Right.
You know, they thought they'd been doing just fine, but they got feedback that says they weren't.
Right.
Okay. There was one school where I was going in to give a talk, and in advance, I sent around a little survey where I had people talk about what in their 7Cs findings, their individual reports, what was surprising, what did they do as a consequence, and what do they think the results were? What difference did it make that they did what they did as differently? And I got a lot of really interesting feedback where teachers said, you know, I didn't know they knew I cared, but my rates on caring are really high. So they must know that I care. Some teachers say, you know, I thought I was doing great at Clarify, but my results say I'm not.
Right.
And so as a consequence, well, I remember one said, I created a little box that I put in the front of the room where at the end of every classroom, as class period, as they go out, they can drop a note in the box about what they're still confused about. And then I'll start the next period by reviewing whatever they were confused about. See, and said, I remember that teacher said, I don't know if I've completely solved the project problem, but I know I made a little progress.
Right.
Okay. And you get a few teachers who say they blew off their results. I remember one place, a teacher said, my kids didn't take it seriously, so I didn't take it seriously and haven't done anything differently. But then we had a faculty meeting where I reported out the results for the building, and teachers were testifying in the meeting about how useful the result findings were. And the teacher who said they blew it off confessed. He stood up and he said, that was me.
Right.
And he said, I'm gonna go back now and look at my results more carefully. And finally, in that same school, there's a little video I could even find and share with you. There's a teacher who really wanted to tell me what she had done. She was teaching in a 10th grade remedial reading class to 10 boys who had IEPs. And she said, the kids kept asking me, what happened with that survey we took? What happened with that? Did you get any results back? She said, yeah. She said, I did. And our weakest area was classroom management. And she took her report and showed it to the kids and circled the places where she was disappointed with the classroom management result and posted it on the wall. And then she had a conversation with the kids, or how could we do better? And the kids got engaged and they brainstormed. We can make sure we get here on time. We can stop interrupting each other. We can do things. And she said after that, every time the class got a little disorderly, she would point to the wall and say, tripod. And the kids would say, oh yeah. And they would settle down.
Right.
And so
that consistent reference point. Right.
Yeah. So there are a lot of anecdotes about when people take the findings seriously and respond, they can improve. But taking them seriously is the first step in that.
Absolutely. So, thinking about mentioning the faculty meeting, I wonder what your perspective is on the role of schools and districts in when they have data like this and supporting the growth of teachers. I think the examples we're thinking of are teachers who drove themselves, like they reviewed their data, they saw gaps and then brought it to their students or thought about their own practice or both and then improved. But what do you think about the role of the school or the district in supporting that from a larger kind of system level?
Yeah, one of the most memorable patterns is the fact that there is more variation across classrooms within schools than there is variation across schools. Okay, we tend often to identify the strong schools and the weak schools. The biggest variation is between the strong classrooms and the weak classrooms. Okay, and so we need to be organized as schools and as districts to be able to support teachers who struggle in the classroom. And that's a subtle prospect because it's hard to get people to self-nominate, to self-identify. But the leaders in the districts got the roster of tripod findings, right? And so even if they're anonymous at the teacher level, even if you don't know which teacher is which, you know there are 25% of your teachers in your room for whom less than half their kids think the classroom is well managed, right? And so you can start to structure discourse at the building level, saying we have this issue, we don't even care which teachers are the ones that have it most. We do care that they have it, but let's think together about what some of our patterns are and ways we could do things differently, and check back with one another periodically to think about progress. You can even do real simple little surveys outside of the tripod surveys that are just very pointed. And I don't know if we still have the text message survey where we sample in the building, but people can use those surveys just on one little issue to track progress.
Right. Pulse surveys, right. Yeah, we could absolutely.
Yeah. And so the change is possible. There are schools that go through metamorphosis, but it takes really dedicated leadership. Okay, I produced a report on 2010 based on a conference where we brought in schools that were having big achievement gains with average kids. Asked them, how'd you do that? Okay, and there was a pattern in how they did that. And more school systems or school leaders need to plug into really effective models and frameworks for leadership, and then be courageous in doing that. We have a phrase I call earned authority. The leader who earns the authority, shows up to the meeting early, takes it all in, follows up, and really leads and doesn't back down from resistors.
Right.
The two phrases that came up, just asking, you got a resistor? The question is, help me understand your resistance. And they'll keep going through, and ultimately they'll throw their hands up and say, I just can't do any better. Okay, well, let us help you. Okay, help me understand and let us help you are really effective leadership phrases.
Right.
So it can be done, but it takes commitment, and tripod survey results are data that leaders can use, but leaders have to decide to be leaders,
right,
in order to make it happen.
Well, thank you for that. And just to conclude our conversation, I want to wrap up with a question about you and what your motivation and career in education has looked like. Why are you doing this work? I would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, the quick story is, and I say, when I was 8 years old, that makes it sound like it wasn't that quick a story, but it's history. When I was 8 years old, I asked somebody, what do you do as a job to make things better for people? That's what I wanted to do as a grown-up. And they told me city planning. So I grew up planning to be a city planner. Found my way to economics, got a PhD in economics from MIT, got hired at Harvard, still thought it was jobs and so on. So I started teaching state and local economic development, discovered around 1990 that standardized reading and math scores predicted most of the racial wage inequality that I became an economist to have an impact on. And so if it was skills that made the big difference, then instead of working so much on business subsidies, I should start working on how do we help schools and learning to be more effective. So during the 90s, I gradually transitioned over, stopped teaching state and local economic development around 2000, was now teaching economic youth development, education related stuff. Was writing a couple chapters for a book called The Black White Test Score Gap. As a consequence of that, got invited to Shaker Heights, Ohio to advise them. And sort of the rest is history after that, because Shaker Heights got me into working on education with schools. I continued to write and do research on that. The MET project, the Measures of Effective Teaching, the Gates project was a big boost in the work that we were doing. But then around 2007, 2008, 2009, noticed in nationally representative data that the achievement gap is in place by the time kids are 2 years old. And so I decided I wanted to design something that could go to scale to help parents know what they need to do in order to give their kids a strong enough start in life that they wouldn't fall behind less than half the way to kindergarten. And so that's my passion now, even though I still have fingers in tripod. I'm still doing consulting on family engagement in schools, but my centerpiece is really the basics. If people want to check it out, thebasics.org, just thebasics.org. And we're in a lot of cities around the country trying to do entire communities to make sure that parents know what they need to do in order so that their kids don't fall behind and actually thrive. So not just a matter of not falling behind, it's a matter of flourishing.
Right.
And that's a longer conversation.
Well, so thankful for your time today, Ron, and we appreciate your insight. Love the work that Tripod's doing, and as everyone can see, we follow up on what Ron just mentioned. The basics, is it .org or .com?
.org.
.org. Basics.org and Tripod surveys. So thanks so much, Ron, and we'll talk to you soon.